The man everyone stopped listening to. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. It was printed neatly, folded twice, and addressed to the operations manager of the Raven Falls Hydroelectric Station. No one answered it. 3 weeks later, another letter arrived, then a third, then a fourth. Each one came from the same sender, Walter Hayes, retired senior systems engineer, age 72, former employee number 0147. Most of the people currently working at Raven Falls had never met him. A few recognized the name. Almost none of them knew why it mattered. Outside town, autumn fog drifted low across the river as Walter sat alone in a small workshop behind his house. The building smelled faintly of machine oil, cedar wood, and old paper. The workshop had once been crowded with projects. Now it mostly held memories. A worn drafting table stood beneath a narrow window. Metal shelves carried decades of engineering manuals. Coffee rings stained notebooks filled with calculations no one would probably ever read again. Walter adjusted his glasses and studied a stack of public maintenance reports spread across the table. He wasn't searching for mistakes, not exactly. He was searching for patterns. That was what engineers did, or at least what the good ones did. The reports were routine documents available to the public. Most people would have found them painfully boring. Inspection schedules, equipment updates, sensor calibrations, maintenance delays, nothing alarming, nothing dramatic, yet something bothered him, a detail too small to explain, a feeling he couldn't shake. Walter leaned back in his chair and stared toward the window. Rain clouds were gathering over the distant hills. The river beyond the trees moved quietly, carrying leaves downstream. For a moment he considered closing the reports and forgetting about them. After all, retirement was supposed to mean letting go. His daughter reminded him of that often. "You're not responsible for that place anymore, Dad." She had said it during dinner the previous month. "You spent 40 years worrying about those turbines." Walter had smiled. 42. She laughed. "See, that's exactly my point." At the time he'd laughed too, but now sitting alone in the workshop, the words felt less comforting. Because responsibility doesn't always disappear when a paycheck does. Sometimes it stays, quietly, long after everyone expects it to leave. A sharp knock interrupted his thoughts. Walter opened the workshop door to find his neighbor, Frank, carrying a fishing rod over one shoulder. Frank was younger by nearly 10 years but looked older, thanks to decades of construction work and too much time in the sun. "You coming out today?" Frank asked. Walter glanced toward the reports. "Maybe later." Frank followed his gaze. "The dam again?" Walter sighed. "You've been studying those papers for weeks." Walter shrugged. "Something feels off." Frank smiled politely. The kind of smile people use when they don't quite understand, but don't want to argue. "You ever think maybe you're looking for problems because that's what you did your whole life?" Walter didn't answer immediately, because he had considered that possibility, more than once. Age brings experience, but it also brings uncertainty. He knew that. Maybe he was seeing ghosts in spreadsheets. Maybe retirement had left him with too much time. Maybe he simply missed feeling useful. "I hope you're right," Walter finally said. Frank nodded. "Come fishing if you change your mind." After he left, silence returned to the workshop. Only the ticking wall clock remained. Walter looked back at the reports. Then he noticed something. Again. The same detail. A maintenance delay involving a pressure monitoring assembly. Small, ordinary, easy to ignore. Except it wasn't the first delay, or the second, or even the third. He pulled older reports from a cabinet and began comparing dates. Minutes passed, then an hour. The deeper he looked, the more uncomfortable he became. Individually, none of the decisions were dangerous. Together, they created a chain. A chain he had seen before. Years ago. Very early in his career. Back when the facility was still under construction. Walter stood abruptly and crossed the workshop. From the highest shelf, he retrieved a dusty cardboard storage box. The tape had yellowed with age. His handwriting covered one side. Archive notes, original system design. His heartbeat quickened. Not from excitement, from memory. Inside the box were notebooks, sketches, calculations, and engineering records dating back more than 4 decades. The paper felt fragile. The corners were worn. Yet everything remained organized. Walter had always believed documentation mattered, because someday someone would need it. He opened one notebook, then another, page after page. The years seemed to peel away. He remembered the young engineers, the long nights, the arguments over safety margins, the endless calculations. And then he found it. A diagram, hand-drawn, marked with red pencil. Walter froze. Outside, wind rattled tree branches. Rain began tapping softly against the roof. His eyes moved slowly across the page. There it was, the forgotten vulnerability. Not a defect, not a flaw exactly, a rare operational condition that could create dangerous stress if several unrelated systems happened to fail simultaneously. At the time, the original team had built multiple safeguards around it. Layers of protection, backups, monitoring procedures, special inspections. The odds of everything failing together were extremely low, but not impossible. Never impossible. Walter reached for the latest maintenance report. His stomach tightened. Several of those protective layers had gradually disappeared over the years, not because anyone was careless, not because anyone was malicious, simply because time changes organizations. People retire, departments reorganize, priorities shift, institutional memory fades, and eventually, knowledge that once lived inside hundreds of conversations survives only in forgotten documents. The rain outside intensified. Walter stared at the notebook, then at the report, then back again. For nearly 10 minutes he said nothing. Finally he picked up the phone. He called the station. After several transfers, he reached an administrative assistant. Polite, professional, busy. She promised to pass along his concerns. Walter thanked her and hung up. Deep down, he already knew what would happen. The same thing that had happened every other time. Nothing. He sat quietly as evening settled over the valley. The workshop darkened. The river disappeared into shadows. For the first time all day, doubt returned. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe the safeguards still existed in ways he couldn't see. Maybe newer engineers had already addressed the issue. He wanted that to be true, more than anything. Then his phone buzzed. An automated weather alert. A major storm system was expected to move through the region within the week. Heavy rainfall, strong winds, potential flooding. Walter looked once more at the old diagram, then at the maintenance reports, then at the storm forecast glowing on the screen. A cold feeling settled in his chest. Slowly, he reached for a calculator and opened the blank notebook. If the forecast held, if the water levels rose as expected, if the delayed equipment remained offline, there was a sequence. A very specific sequence. One he hadn't thought about in decades. He began writing numbers. Outside, rain hammered the roof. Inside, only the scratching of a pencil filled the room. An hour later, Walter stopped calculating. He stared at the final figure on the page. The timeline wasn't exact, but it was close enough. Close enough to make his hands go still. For the first time since retiring, Walter wasn't worried about being ignored. He was worried that he might be right. The storm no one feared. By Thursday afternoon, the storm had become the most talked about thing in the valley. Not because people were frightened, because they were inconvenienced. Local stores sold extra batteries. Weather updates played between radio songs. Parents checked school announcements. Fishermen secured their boats along the riverbanks. Life continued, as it always did. At Raven Falls Hydroelectric Station, preparations were equally routine. The facility had survived stronger storms before, much stronger. The massive concrete structure stood against the river like a permanent part of the landscape itself. For most employees, the incoming weather barely registered as a concern. Inside the control center, glowing screens tracked water levels, turbine output, and system status reports. Operators drank coffee, exchanged shifts, and reviewed standard procedures. Everything looked normal, at least on the surface. Miles away, Walter Hayes sat in his workshop, staring at numbers that refused to leave his mind. The calculations he had made the previous night lay spread across his drafting table. He had checked them 3 times, then 4, then 5. The conclusion never changed. The storm itself wasn't the problem. The danger was timing. Too many small vulnerabilities were lining up at once. A delayed inspection, a monitoring assembly still awaiting replacement, backup systems operating below recommended redundancy. Each issue seemed insignificant alone. Together they formed a pattern, and patterns were what Walter trusted most. Not instincts, not assumptions, patterns. His phone rang shortly after noon. The caller ID displayed a familiar name, Tom Reynolds. Walter hadn't spoken to him in nearly 8 years. Tom had started as a junior engineer under Walter's supervision and eventually worked his way into operations management. Back then, he had been sharp, curious, and stubborn. Walter remembered liking him. Tom. Hey, Walter. The voice sounded older than he remembered. Tired. You got my message? Walter asked. A pause. Yeah. Walter waited. Rain tapped lightly against the workshop window. I looked into some of what you mentioned, Tom said. And? Another pause. Most of the systems are operating within acceptable limits. Walter closed his eyes briefly. The answer didn't surprise him. It was exactly what he expected. Tom? Yeah? For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Tom sighed. You think the storm could trigger the sequence? Walter looked at the old notebook lying open beside him. I think the conditions are closer than they should be. Tom exhaled slowly. Management isn't going to shut down operations based on a theoretical chain of events. I didn't ask them to. What are you asking? Walter stared through the rain-streaked glass. The river beyond the trees had already begun rising. I'm asking someone to verify the assumptions. Tom didn't answer immediately, because he understood the difference. Verification wasn't panic. Verification was responsibility. I'll see what I can do, Tom finally said. It wasn't a promise, but it was something. After the call ended, Walter felt no relief, only uncertainty. As evening approached, the storm intensified. Heavy clouds rolled across the valley like dark waves. Wind bent trees along the riverbanks. Rainfall increased steadily. Weather stations reported rising water levels throughout the region. At Raven Falls, operators monitored the incoming flow. Everything remained manageable. Everything remained predictable, at least according to the dashboards. But dashboards only displayed the information they were designed to display. Walter knew that better than anyone. Years earlier, he had helped design parts of the monitoring architecture. He understood its strengths. He also understood its blind spots. That night, he couldn't sleep. Around midnight, he drove toward a hill overlooking the valley. The road curved through pine forests slick with rain. Fog drifted between the trees. When he reached the overlook, he parked and stepped out into the cold wind. Far below, the hydroelectric station glowed against the darkness. Rows of white lights reflected across the swollen river. From a distance, the facility appeared calm, orderly, controlled. Yet Walter couldn't shake the feeling growing in his chest, the feeling that something important was being missed. He stood there nearly 20 minutes, watching, listening, thinking. Then he returned home. At the station, meanwhile, small anomalies had begun appearing. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make headlines. One sensor briefly lost communication. A pressure reading fluctuated unexpectedly. A diagnostic report arrived several minutes late. Operators logged the events and continued working. Individually, none of them justified alarm, but they shared one troubling characteristic. They were occurring in different departments, different systems, different reporting channels. No single person could see all of them at once. The pieces remained scattered, like fragments of a puzzle nobody realized they were assembling. Just after 1 a.m., Tom Reynolds sat alone in his office reviewing maintenance records. Walter's concerns kept bothering him, not because he fully agreed, because he couldn't completely dismiss them. He pulled archived reports from previous years, compared inspection histories, reviewed equipment notes. Then his expression slowly changed. There it was, a pattern. Small, subtle, easy to overlook, yet undeniably present. Tom leaned closer to the screen. Several safeguards had indeed been deferred over time, not intentionally, not recklessly, simply through years of budget decisions, staffing shortages, and shifting priorities. The system remained compliant, technically, but compliance and resilience were not always the same thing. A sudden knock interrupted his thoughts. An operator appeared in the doorway. Got something strange. Tom followed him into the control room. Several engineers gathered around the workstation. One of the monitoring systems had generated conflicting readings. Nothing severe, yet the data didn't make sense. Sensor issue? Someone asked. Maybe. Another engineer frowned. Could be communications lag. Tom studied the screen. For a brief moment, Walter's notebook flashed through his mind. The sequence, the pattern, the warnings. Outside, rain hammered the facility. Water surged through spillways illuminated by floodlights. The river was rising faster now. Not dangerously, not yet, but steadily, very steadily. Back in his workshop, Walter sat awake at the drafting table. An untouched cup of coffee had gone cold beside him. The old notebook remained open. The pages seemed almost alive beneath the desk lamp. Every few minutes he checked weather reports. Every few minutes he checked river data. The numbers continued moving in the wrong direction. At 2:03 a.m., his phone vibrated. A message from Tom. Only 6 words. You may need to be available. Walter stared at the screen. His stomach tightened. Not because the message confirmed disaster, because it confirmed uncertainty. And uncertainty was often where disasters began. He stood and walked toward the workshop window. Rain lashed against the glass. Wind howled through the darkness. Far beyond the trees, hidden somewhere in the night, thousands of tons of water pressed against concrete designed decades ago. Concrete Walter knew better than almost anyone alive. For several long moments he said nothing. Then he quietly gathered his notes, just in case. Because after 42 years as an engineer, he had learned one lesson above all others. When systems fail, they rarely fail all at once. They fail in whispers, small warnings, tiny inconsistencies, minor anomalies, until suddenly those whispers begin speaking the same language. And at 2:17 a.m., inside Raven Falls Hydroelectric Station, one of the facility's critical control systems abruptly shut down. For a few seconds, nobody understood why. But Walter did. The sequence had begun. The night the valley remembered his name. At 2:17 a.m., the first alarm sounded. Not a dramatic siren, just a sharp electronic tone inside the Raven Falls Control Center. One monitor flashed yellow, then another. Operators immediately began checking diagnostics. Most expected a routine fault, a communication issue, a sensor problem, something manageable, something familiar. But within minutes, additional warnings appeared, the kind that were never supposed to arrive together. Across the room, engineers exchanged increasingly concerned glances. Nobody was panicking. Not yet. The atmosphere was worse than panic. It was confusion. The data didn't make sense. Several systems were reporting conditions that should have been impossible under normal operating circumstances. One display contradicted another. Pressure values fluctuated unexpectedly. Automated responses failed to trigger exactly when expected. The facility wasn't collapsing. The dam wasn't breaking. But something deep inside the system was behaving in ways nobody fully understood. Tom Reynolds stood motionless in front of the central display wall. A cold realization settled over him. Walter hadn't predicted a single failure. He had predicted a chain. And chains were much harder to stop. Outside, rain battered the valley. Water thundered through spillways beneath towering floodlights. The river had become a moving wall of darkness. Inside the station, teams began working through emergency procedures. Yet every solution seemed to reveal another question. Every answer uncovered another uncertainty. At 2:29 a.m., Tom made the call. The phone rang twice. Walter answered immediately, as if he had been expecting it. Maybe he had. Tom didn't waste time explaining. He didn't need to. Walter already understood. 20 minutes later, headlights cut through the storm as his old pickup truck had climbed the access road toward the facility. Rain swept across the windshield. Wind pushed against the vehicle. The road ahead blurred beneath sheets of water. Walter gripped the steering wheel tightly. Not from fear, from memory. 42 years, thousands of shifts, countless nights spent inside the station. He knew every tunnel, every maintenance corridor, every vibration the turbines made under heavy load. Yet tonight felt different, because tonight he was returning not as an employee, not as a supervisor, not as an expert. He was returning as a man carrying knowledge nobody realized had been lost. The security gate opened before he reached it. Someone was waiting. By the time Walter entered the control center, exhaustion already hung over the room. Engineers moved quickly between stations. Conversations overlapped. Phones rang constantly. The air smelled faintly of coffee and overheated electronics. For a moment, nobody noticed him. Then Tom stepped forward. Their eyes met. No speeches, no dramatic reunion, just a brief nod between two engineers, one asking for help, the other already prepared to give it. "Show me everything." Tom led him to the operations displays. Walter studied the data in silence. Several younger engineers watched from nearby. Some recognized his name, others didn't. None of that mattered. For nearly 10 minutes he asked questions, short ones, specific ones. What was replaced? What wasn't? When was the last inspection? Which software version? Which backup path? The questions came rapidly. Each answer seemed to narrow his focus. Then Walter pointed toward a series of archived maintenance records. Those. An engineer blinked. Those aren't related. Walter looked at him calmly. Open them. The room fell quiet, not from shock but from concentration. The engineer complied. Thousands of pages appeared on screen. Modification histories, equipment upgrades, operational revisions stretching back decades. Walter scanned the records. Then he found it. A seemingly insignificant change implemented nearly 12 years earlier. The update had improved efficiency, reduced maintenance costs, received excellent performance reviews. Everyone involved had acted reasonably, yet the modification carried an unintended consequence. It quietly removed one layer of protection the original design team had built around the rare failure sequence. Not because anyone made a foolish mistake, because nobody remaining understood why that protection existed. The knowledge had retired with the people who created it. A silence settled across the room. Not an emotional silence, a professional one. The kind that appears when experienced people recognize a hard truth. Tom stared at the screen. My God. Walter shook his head gently. No. He pointed toward another display. We still have options. And suddenly the room changed. Not because the crisis disappeared, because they finally understood it. Understanding creates direction. Direction creates action. Teams reorganized. Assignments shifted. Engineers began working from a shared picture instead of scattered assumptions. The problem remained dangerous, but it was no longer invisible. For the next several hours, the control center became a place of relentless focus. Rain continued pounding the facility. Water levels remained high. Every decision mattered. Walter moved from station to station, answering questions, reviewing procedures, and helping younger engineers interpret systems older than many of them. At one point, a junior operator hesitated before implementing a critical adjustment. Walter noticed immediately. Nervous? The young man nodded. A little. Walter smiled faintly. Good. Good engineers get nervous. The young man laughed despite the tension, then completed the procedure. Hour by hour, conditions stabilized. Not quickly, not dramatically, gradually, like a knot being untangled, one strand at a time. Shortly after sunrise, the worst of the storm finally began moving east. Rainfall weakened. River levels stopped climbing. For the first time all night, people allowed themselves to breathe. The crisis wasn't remembered because of a spectacular rescue. There were no helicopters, no television crews, no dramatic countdown. The valley slept through most of it. What happened inside Raven Falls was quieter than that. A group of engineers solved a difficult problem before it became something worse. And at the center of that effort stood a retired man most people had stopped listening to. Weeks later, internal reviews filled conference rooms. Reports were written, processes examined, recommendations issued. One conclusion appeared repeatedly. The facility needed a way to preserve institutional knowledge before it disappeared. Not manuals, not databases. Knowledge, the experience living inside people. Within months, a mentorship initiative was launched. Retired engineers were invited back regularly to share lessons with younger teams, not because they knew everything, because they knew things documentation sometimes missed. One crisp autumn morning, Walter returned to his workshop. Life looked much the same as before. The river flowed quietly beyond the trees. Sunlight filtered through the window. Dust floated above stacks of old notebooks. He was making coffee when he heard a knock at the door. A young woman stood outside, carrying a backpack and a notebook. She looked nervous. Mr. Hayes? Walter nodded. I'm Maya. She shifted awkwardly. I just started at Raven Falls. Walter waited. She smiled. They said you might be willing to explain these old system diagrams. For a moment, neither moved. Then Walter looked past her toward the river. The same valley, the same station. Yet something had changed. Not the machinery, the connection between generations, the thread that had nearly been lost. A small smile appeared on his face. Come in. Hours later, sunlight stretched across the workshop floor as old blueprints covered the drafting table once again. One generation teaching another. Questions being asked. Lessons being passed forward. Outside, The river continued its endless journey through the valley. Inside, knowledge continued its own. And in the end, that was Walter's true legacy. Not that he had been right, not that others had been wrong, but that experience once shared could outlive the people who carried it. The valley never built a monument. There was no ceremony, no public recognition. Most residents never learned how close the station had come to a serious failure. Life simply continued. But every so often, when a young engineer opened an old notebook or asked an extra question before approving a change, a small part of Walter's work lived on. And for a man who had spent his entire career protecting systems nobody noticed unless they failed, that was more than enough. The things that don't make headlines. 6 months later, the storm had become a story people rarely mentioned. That was the strange thing about disasters that never fully happened. The public remembered the weather, the flooded roads, the power outages in neighboring counties, the damaged fishing docks downstream. But very few people knew what had happened inside Raven Falls Hydroelectric Station that night. And even fewer understood how close the facility had come to facing a much more serious situation. Life had moved on, as it always did. The river continued flowing. The turbines continued turning. Electricity continued reaching homes across the valley. From the outside, everything looked exactly the same. Walter preferred it that way. On a cool spring morning, he unlocked the door to his workshop and stepped inside carrying a paper bag from the local bakery. Sunlight streamed through the narrow windows. Dust floated lazily through the golden beams. The old wall clock ticked steadily. Nothing in the room suggested that engineers from across the region now occasionally visited to seek his advice. Nothing suggested that utility executives had quietly cited his warnings in internal training seminars. Nothing suggested that his notebooks had become required reading for certain engineering teams. The workshop remained what it had always been, a small room filled with tools, sketches, and unfinished projects. Walter set the bag on his desk and poured coffee into a chipped ceramic mug. For the first time in years, the room no longer felt like a museum. It felt useful again. A knock sounded at the door. Right on schedule. Maya entered carrying 2 notebooks and an oversized blueprint tube. She had become a regular visitor over the past several months. Young, curious, sometimes overly confident, sometimes uncertain. Exactly the kind of engineer Walter enjoyed teaching. Morning. She dropped her materials onto the drafting table. I have questions. Walter smiled. You always do. Good questions. She unrolled a large diagram across the table. For the next hour, they discussed system redundancies, historical design decisions, and the reasons certain engineering shortcuts often became expensive mistakes years later. The conversations reminded Walter of something he had nearly forgotten. Knowledge was never really stored in documents. Documents helped. Blueprints helped. Records helped. But real understanding passed from one person to another, question by question, mistake by mistake, story by story. Around midday, Maya paused while taking notes. Can I ask something? Walter looked up. You just did. She rolled her eyes. You know what I mean. He leaned back. Go ahead. Maya hesitated. Why didn't you stop warning them? Walter frowned slightly. About the station? She nodded. Most people would have given up. Wind rustled leaves in the trees. For a moment, Walter considered the question. Then he shrugged. I almost did. Maya looked surprised. Really? Several times. She studied him carefully. I don't think anyone tells that part of the story. Walter laughed softly. That's because people prefer simple stories. What kind? The kind where someone knows they're right. He glanced toward the window. The truth is, I wasn't completely sure. Maya lowered her pen. Walter continued. Experience doesn't eliminate doubt. It doesn't? No, he smiled. It just teaches you which doubts deserve attention. The answer lingered between them. Years earlier, Walter might have explained the situation differently. Now he understood something he hadn't understood when he was younger. Wisdom wasn't certainty. Wisdom was learning how to live with uncertainty responsibly. That afternoon, after Maya left, Walter drove into town. The hardware store needed a replacement part for an old milling machine. The owner greeted him by name. Several customers nodded as he entered. A year earlier, many of those same people might have walked past without noticing him. Now conversations seemed to last longer. People asked questions, not because of the incident itself, because stories had a way of spreading, especially in small towns. Most details became distorted along the way. Walter didn't mind. People enjoyed stories. Reality was usually quieter. As he left the store, he noticed a familiar figure sitting on a bench outside. Tom Reynolds, holding 2 cups of coffee. Walter immediately suspected trouble. Tom stood and handed him one of the cups. "Thought you might be nearby." Walter accepted it. "That sounds suspicious." Tom laughed. They sat together overlooking the river. For several minutes neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable, earned. Finally Tom gestured toward the water. "You know, I still think about that night." Walter nodded. "So do I. I keep wondering what would have happened if you hadn't called." Walter looked at him. "You called me. You know what I mean." The older man smiled. Perhaps he did. Perhaps they both did. Tom stared across the river. The review board finished its final report. Walter groaned. "That sounds exciting." "It's actually interesting." "I don't believe you." Tom laughed again. Then his expression became more thoughtful. "The biggest recommendation wasn't technical." Walter raised an eyebrow. "No?" "No." Tom shook his head. "It was communication." Walter waited. The report basically concluded that information wasn't the problem. What was? Tom looked down at his coffee. People stopped listening to each other. The words hung in the air. Simple, accurate, difficult. Walter knew exactly what he meant. Organizations often believed their greatest risks came from machinery, or software, or infrastructure. Sometimes the real danger was much smaller. Experts working in isolation, departments operating separately, generations failing to share knowledge, experience being treated as outdated rather than valuable. The river flowed steadily below them, unhurried, unconcerned. Tom eventually stood. "I should get back." Walter nodded. As his friend walked away, he felt an unexpected sense of peace. Not pride, not satisfaction, something quieter. The feeling that a chapter of life had closed properly. That evening, Walter returned home and opened one of his oldest notebooks. The first page contained notes written when he was 23 years old. Young, ambitious, certain he could solve almost anything. He smiled at the handwriting. Back then he thought engineering was about building systems. Now, after a lifetime of experience, he understood that engineering was also about people. People made decisions. People carried knowledge. People passed lessons forward. And people sometimes forgot how much they needed one another. Outside, the sun slowly disappeared beyond the valley. The river reflected streaks of orange and gold. Walter closed the notebook and turned off the workshop lights. Darkness settled gently across the room. Tomorrow there would be more questions from Maya, more diagrams, more stories, more lessons. Not because the valley needed saving, because the future always needed teachers. And as Walter locked the door and looked one last time toward the distant glow of Raven Falls, he realized something simple. The most important thing he had ever built wasn't a turbine, a control system, or a safety protocol. It was the knowledge he left behind. And unlike concrete or steel, that legacy would continue growing long after he was gone.